June 7th, 1943. Bougainville, Solomon Sea. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai's hands moved across the controls with the precision of a master swordsman. 64 kills, third highest ace in the Imperial Navy, untouchable in the sky. Below him, the Solomon Sea glittered like polished steel. His A6M0 hummed beneath him, light as silk, deadly as a blade. For 2 years, this machine had made him a god. The radio crackled, American fighters ahead, escorting bombers. Wildcats, probably. Clumsy, predictable. Sakai rolled into his signature attack, a high-side diving pass, already imagining the clean kill, the effortless climb away, using the Zero's legendary agility. Asterisk, we own these skies. We always have. Asterisk. But the lead American didn't break, didn't dive. It turned times into times him, hard, impossibly fast, and suddenly Sakai was staring down 6 enormous machine guns. The sky erupted in traces. He broke left, pulling maximum Gs, muscle memory screaming through his hands. Asterisk, no fighter can follow. A 0 through this turn, asterisk, but the American stayed with him. Gaining. His wingman's voice shattered across the radio, raw with terror. They're not running. Asterisk, they're hunting us. Asterisk. A 0 exploded off his starboard wing, then another. Sakai's engine coughed smoke as he clawed for the clouds, his mind reeling with one impossible thought. Asterisk, what are these machines? Asterisk, the 0 had been invincible for so long that its dominance felt less like military advantage and more like natural law. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai understood this in his bones as he taxied his aircraft back toward Rabaul's scarred runway, his hands still trembling on the stick. His flight suit soaked through with sweat that had nothing to do with the tropical heat. Behind him, the Solomon Sea stretched empty and blue, beautiful and indifferent, holding no evidence of the nightmare that had just unfolded above its waters. 3 zeros gone. 3 pilots. Men he'd flown with for months. Men whose families he knew, whose laughter he'd heard just that morning, simply erased from existence in less than 10 minutes of combat. And the Americans? Not a single fighter downed. Not one parachute blossoming white against the sky. Not one small victory to carry home and build a story around. Just the smoking wreckage of Japanese aircraft spiraling into the sea, and the memory of those massive American fighters turning, climbing, firing with a methodical efficiency that felt less like aerial combat and more like industrial slaughter. Sakai's 0 shuddered as he brought it down, the landing gear groaning under the stress of a machine that had been pushed far beyond its design limits. And when the wheels finally kissed the coral runway, he felt no relief, only a cold hollow spreading through his chest like winter fog. The ground crew rushed toward his aircraft and stopped dead when they saw the damage. Bullet holes stitched across the fuselage in neat lines, each one a whisper away from killing him. The thin aluminum skin of the 0, so light and elegant, had been shredded like rice paper. Sakai climbed out slowly, his legs unsteady, and stood on the wing looking at his aircraft as if seeing it for the first time. For 2 years this machine had been an extension of his body, an instrument of precision and art. Now it looked fragile, breakable, mortal. The other survivors landed in grim succession, each aircraft bearing its own constellation of wounds. And when the final count came in, the numbers told a story that no one wanted to hear. 12 Zeros had engaged the American formation. 9 had returned. Of those 9, 6 were so badly damaged they'd need days of repair work. The Americans had lost nothing. The debriefing room at Rabaul was thick with cigarette smoke and heavier with silence. Squadron commanders sat around a table made from scavenged packing crates, their faces illuminated by the harsh glare of a single electric bulb that swung slightly in the breeze from broken windows. Sakai stood and described what he'd seen, choosing his words carefully, knowing how insane they would sound. The American fighters were bigger than Wildcats, he explained, heavier. But they didn't fly heavy. They matched the 0 turn for turn in the initial engagement, then used sheer power to climb away when the fight turned against them, resetting the engagement on their terms, diving back down with terrifying speed to rake the 0s, with concentrated machine gun fire that punched through aluminum and flesh with equal ease. One of the younger pilots, barely 20 years old, with perhaps 15 combat missions under his belt, raised his hand like a schoolboy asking permission to speak. His voice cracked when he said the Americans hadn't tried to dogfight at all, that they'd worked in pairs, one attacking while the other covered, switching roles with practiced coordination that made individual skill almost irrelevant. Another pilot added that the American aircraft seemed to absorb punishment that would have destroyed a Zero instantly, that he'd seen one take hits that should have ignited its fuel tanks, watched it trailing smoke, and yet it had kept flying, kept fighting, eventually climbing away under its own power, while the Zero that damaged it fell burning into the sea. The squadron commander, a veteran of China and Pearl Harbor, with more kills than most pilots would ever see enemy aircraft, stubbed out his cigarette and asked the question that hung in the room like poison gas. What were these machines? Intelligence reports had mentioned something called the F6F, he said, but the details were vague, contradictory, the kind of information that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Some reports claimed it was just an improved Wildcat. Others suggested it was an entirely new design. None had prepared them for what they'd encountered today. Sakai found himself thinking about the early days of the war, those intoxicating months of 1941 and 1942, when the Zero had swept Allied aircraft from the skies with contemptuous ease. He remembered his first kill over the Philippines, a lumbering American bomber that had seemed to hang in the air like a practice target, and how the Wildcats that tried to protect it had been so painfully outmatched that shooting them down had felt less like combat and more like a training exercise with live ammunition. The Americans had been brave, certainly. Their pilots had pressed attacks even when it meant certain death, had tried to protect their bombers even when their fighters were clearly inferior. But their machines had been crude, heavy, slow to respond. The Zero had danced around them like a raptor toying with field mice. American pilots had been ordered never to dogfight a Zero, to dive away and run, to survive rather than engage. That had been the natural order of things. That had been how the sky worked. Sakai walked out of the debriefing into the tropical night, the air thick with moisture and the sound of distant generators. Other pilots stood in small groups, smoking, talking in low voices that carried an edge of something Sakai had never heard before in Japanese aviators. Not fear exactly, but uncertainty, doubt. The corrosive question of whether the tools they'd been given, the tactics they'd been taught, the philosophy they'd embraced, were still sufficient for the war they were now fighting. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the concerns of men, and somewhere out there in the darkness the American fleet was steaming, its carriers packed with these new fighters, these brutal, efficient machines that had rewritten the rules of aerial combat in a single engagement. Sakai touched the silk scarf at his neck, a gift from his sister before he'd left Japan 3 years ago, and wondered how many more mornings he would wake to see the sun rise over the Pacific. The Zero that had made him a legend, that had carried him through 64 kills, suddenly felt like a relic from another age. Beautiful, elegant, obsolete, and the Americans were just getting started. 3,000 miles east, on the deck of the USS Essex, cutting through Pacific swells under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Flatley walked among his pilots with the calm deliberation of a man who had seen the future and intended to shape it. The Hellcats lined up on the carrier deck gleamed in the morning sun, their broad wings and muscled fuselages looking almost brutish compared to the sleek elegance of the aircraft they were built to destroy. Flatley paused beside one, running his hand along the armored plate that surrounded the cockpit, metal thick enough to stop a 20mm cannon shell, and thought about the young men who would never come home, because earlier American fighters had lacked this simple, heavy, unglamorous addition. Every feature of the F6F Hellcat was a lesson written in blood, a response to a specific way that Japanese Zeros had killed American pilots, and Flatley had made it his mission to ensure that every man under his command understood the philosophy that had birthed this aircraft. This was not a fighter built for grace or elegance or the romantic notion of aerial dueling that still captivated the imaginations of naval aviators raised on stories of the Great War's aces. This was a weapon system designed with brutal pragmatism to kill Zeros and bring American pilots home alive, and the difference between those two objectives was everything. The pilots gathered around him on the flight deck were young, most of them barely old enough to drink legally, but they carried themselves with a confidence that would have been suicidal 2 years ago. They had reason for that confidence. Flatley began walking them through the Hellcat's design, pointing to features that seemed mundane until you understood what they replaced. The self-sealing fuel tanks that would have saved dozens of pilots who died screaming in cockpits, turned into crematoriums by a single burst of Zero fire. The .650 caliber machine guns, each fed by 400 rounds of ammunition, enough firepower to saw an enemy aircraft in half with a single sustained burst, rather than requiring the extended tracking and precise gunnery that dogfighting demanded. The massive Pratt & Whitney engine producing 2,000 horsepower, brute force that allowed the Hellcat to climb faster than a Zero, dive faster than a Zero, and most critically, dictate the terms of engagement, rather than being forced into the turning battles where Japanese pilots excelled. Flatley's voice carried across the deck over the sound of wind and distant machinery as he explained that they were not trying to outturn the Zero, they were trying to outthink it, to render its advantages irrelevant through systematic tactical innovation. The thatch weave, named for its inventor, was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Two fighters flying parallel courses would scissor back and forth, each pilot watching his wingman's tail, creating a defensive pattern that made it nearly impossible for a Zero to get a clean shot without exposing itself to return fire. When a Zero committed to attacking one Hellcat, the other would already be turning into position, and the Americans would work as a single organism rather than as individual warriors seeking personal glory. Boom and zoom tactics took the philosophy further, using the Hellcat's superior speed and power-to-weight ratio to attack from altitude, make one devastating high-speed pass with overwhelming firepower, then extend away before the Zero could respond, climbing back to altitude on pure horsepower to reset the engagement. It was the opposite of everything the Japanese believed about aerial combat, which prized the close-in turning fight where pilot skill and aircraft agility determined survival. The Americans had looked at that equation and decided they didn't want to play that game at all. They would fight like riflemen, not like swordsmen, striking from distance with massive firepower, then withdrawing before the enemy could bring superior close combat skills to bear. It was pragmatic, efficient, ruthless, and it was working. Flatley pulled out a map of the Pacific and showed his pilots where the war was going, the slow grinding advance westward toward Japan itself. Each island and atoll, marked in red, where American forces would need air superiority to survive the landing operations. The Zeros were still out there, still deadly, still flown by some of the finest pilots in the world, but the balance was shifting. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese pilot training had been dramatically shortened due to fuel shortages and combat losses, that the elite cadre of pre-war aces was being diluted by less experienced replacements, but Flatley warned against complacency with words that rang like hammer strikes on steel. Never assume the enemy is beaten, never give him a fair fight. Use every advantage, press every weakness, and remember that the objective is not personal glory, but mission success and bringing your wingman home. By late August, the doctrine was being tested in the crucible of combat operations across the Solomon Islands, and the results were beginning to tell a story that would reshape the entire character of the Pacific Air War. Hellcat squadrons engaged Zero formations with increasing frequency, and each engagement followed a similar pattern that must have seemed like madness to the Japanese pilots. The Americans refused to dogfight. They worked in pairs or larger groups with disciplined coordination that subordinated individual skill to team effectiveness. They used their superior power to control altitude and choose when to engage. They hit hard with concentrated firepower that destroyed targets in single passes rather than extended combat. And critically, when damaged, they often survived to return home, while Zeros, under similar punishment, disintegrated or burned. September brought the Tarawa operation, and with it one of the first large-scale tests of the new American doctrine against a reformed and reinforced Japanese air group that included veterans like Sakai, alongside fresh replacements, sent to stem the tide of defeats. The Japanese commanders had studied the pattern of recent engagements and developed counter-tactics, planning to use altitude advantage and coordinated attacks to negate the American teamwork advantage. On the morning of the engagement, Sakai led his squadron in a carefully planned ambush, positioning his Zeros at 25,000 feet above the expected American approach route, hoping to dive on the Hellcats before they could react and gain the initiative through surprise. For perhaps 30 seconds, the plan worked. The Zeros dove on the American formation in a coordinated strike that should have scattered the enemy and allowed the Japanese pilots to leverage their superior maneuverability. But the Hellcats didn't scatter. They tightened formation, weaving in practice patterns, and when the Zeros committed to their attacks, they found themselves flying into concentrated fields of 50 caliber fire that turned the sky into a meat grinder. Sakai watched in horror as his carefully coordinated assault dissolved into chaos. Zero after Zero, taking hits and falling away, trailing smoke or fire, while the American formation remained intact, methodically destroying attackers with an efficiency that felt inhuman. His young wingman, a 19-year-old replacement pilot with barely 100 hours in type, made the mistake of trying to turn with a Hellcat that appeared vulnerable, isolating himself from the formation in pursuit of what seemed like an easy kill. Two other Hellcats materialized from nowhere, scissoring in from different angles, and the boys' Zero came apart under converging streams of fire. The unarmored fuel tank, igniting in a brilliant orange fireball that burned itself out in seconds. Sakai tried to rally his squadron, but there was nothing to rally. The Zeros scattered, each pilot fighting for survival, and the Hellcats hunted them with patient, methodical precision. When it was over, 7 Japanese fighters were gone. The Americans lost 1 aircraft whose pilot was picked up by submarine before the sun set. The myth of Zero invincibility wasn't dying. It was already dead. By June 1944, the Pacific War had transformed into a grinding nightmare of attrition that was devouring Japan's military capacity with the inexorable patience of a python crushing its prey. The Marianas, those critical islands that stood as the last barrier between American bombers and the Japanese home islands, had become the focal point for what both sides understood would be a decisive confrontation. Japan's carrier fleet, rebuilt and reinforced after the disasters at Midway and the grinding losses of the Solomons campaign, steamed toward battle with over 400 aircraft and 9 carriers, the largest concentration of naval air power Japan had assembled since the war's opening moves. In the ready rooms and on the hangar decks, the mood among Japanese aviators oscillated between grim determination and barely suppressed desperation. The pilots gathering for Operation Eigo represented the full spectrum of Japan's aviation crisis. Veterans like Saburo Sakai, their faces lined with exhaustion and eyes carrying the haunted knowledge of too many friends lost, sat alongside boys who looked like they should still be in school. Replacement pilots, with perhaps 100 hours of total flight time, being asked to face American aviators, who had 3 times that much training plus combat experience, plus aircraft that outmatched the Zero in nearly every category that mattered in modern warfare. The fuel situation alone told the story of Japan's decline. Training flights had been cut to skeletal minimums, with replacement pilots sometimes arriving at combat squadrons having never fired their guns at a moving target, having never practiced the complex aerobatics that might save their lives in actual combat, having never experienced the crushing G-forces of a high-speed turning fight, or the disorientation of cloud combat, or the simple terror of being shot at by someone who wanted to kill them. But Japan's high command believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that one decisive carrier engagement could still turn the tide, that the warrior spirit and the remaining elite pilots could compensate for material disadvantages through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet from the bridge of his flagship, had staked everything on this operation. His battle plan was actually quite sophisticated, leveraging the Zero's superior range to launch strikes from beyond the distance American aircraft could effectively respond, using island-based air support to multiply his forces, and concentrating his attack on what intelligence suggested would be a dispersed American fleet. On paper, the plan had merit. In reality, it was built on assumptions that were already obsolete, tactical doctrines that presumed Japanese pilot quality and Zero performance could overcome the systematic advantages the Americans had built into every level of their operations. The morning of June 19th dawned clear and hot, the kind of perfect Pacific weather that seemed designed for carrier operations, and Sakai found himself once again strapping into a Zero, checking instruments with the automatic precision of muscle memory, while his mind churned through darker calculations. He had been assigned to lead a formation of 50 fighters and dive bombers, and looking at the young faces of his wingmen, he felt like an executioner leading lambs to slaughter. But he steadied them with words he wasn't sure he believed anymore, reminding them that the Zero was still the finest fighter in the world when flown properly, that their skill and spirit mattered more than the enemy's machines, that fighting with honor would lead to victory even against material disadvantage. For a brief moment, as the strike force formed up and turned toward the American fleet, climbing into the brilliant morning sky with the sun warming their cockpits and the ocean glittering below like hammered metal, it felt like the early days of the war. The same rising sun painted on wings and fuselages, the same thunder of hundreds of engines, the same belief that courage and mastery could overcome any obstacle. Then the radios erupted with frantic warnings, and the sky above them filled with American fighters that had been waiting, positioned perfectly by radar that had detected the Japanese strike force while it was still over 100 miles away. The Hellcats came down like a biblical plague, diving in pairs from 25,000 feet at speeds that turned them into barely visible blurs, and the slaughter began before most of the Japanese pilots even understood they were under attack. Sakai saw his formation disintegrate in the first 30 seconds. Zeros loaded with drop tanks and external ordnance, sluggish and vulnerable, were blown apart by concentrated 50 caliber fire that gave them no chance to fight back, or evade or even understand what was happening. The American pilots were merciless and methodical, working in teams of 2 or 4, setting up attacks with practiced efficiency that made each engagement feel less like aerial combat and more like an industrial process with a predetermined outcome. Sakai's 18-year-old wingman, a boy named Tanaka, who had perhaps 60 hours total flight time and had told Sakai just that morning about his younger sister back in Osaka, lasted exactly 1 pass. A pair of Hellcats rolled in from his blind spot, fired a single coordinated burst that shredded his Zero's unarmored fuel tank, and the boy's aircraft transformed into a fireball that burned so hot and fast there wasn't even time for him to scream over the radio. Sakai tried to rally what remained of his formation, but the situation had devolved into pure chaos, individual survival replacing unit cohesion, and the Americans hunted the scattered Zeros with patient, terrifying efficiency. He found himself engaged by 2 Hellcats that worked in perfect coordination, 1 high and 1 low, and despite pulling every trick he had learned in 4 years of combat, every aerobatic maneuver that had saved his life a dozen times before, the Americans refused to follow him into extended turning fights where his skill might matter. They simply extended when he tried to reverse on them, climbing away on raw horsepower, then reset the engagement from altitude and came back down in another slashing attack that punched holes through his Zero's thin skin and sent hydraulic fluid spraying across his windscreen. All around him the radio filled with the sounds of men dying, frantic calls for help that went unanswered because there was no help to give, young voices crying out in terror or rage, or simply going silent mid-sentence when 50 caliber rounds found them. The sky became a cemetery, the ocean below littered with burning wreckage and white parachutes, and the spreading oil slicks that marked where Zeros had augured in carrying their pilots to the bottom. Sakai's fuel gauge was dropping toward critical. His controls were responding sluggishly, and he made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ran, pointed his damaged Zero east toward the fleet, and pushed the throttle forward and dove away from the engagement, leaving behind the young pilots who had trusted him, who had believed his words about honor and spirit, and the superiority of Japanese aviation. The flight back was a blur of mechanical crisis management, nursing a dying aircraft across miles of empty ocean, while American fighters hunted stragglers, and his radio told the story of complete catastrophe. When he finally found his carrier and brought the Zero in for an emergency landing, his approach was too fast, and his controls too damaged for precision. He hit the deck hard, bounced, and slammed into the crash barrier with enough force to cave in his Zero's nose and throw him forward against his harness hard enough to crack ribs. Ground crew pulled him from the wreckage, and he stumbled onto the flight deck in a daze, looking around at the handful of aircraft that had returned from a strike force of 50. 11 made it back. 39 were gone, along with their pilots, along with any hope that Japanese aviation could still contest the American advance through courage and skill alone. Across the task force, the numbers told an even grimmer story. Over 300 Japanese aircraft lost in a single day, 29 American fighters shot down. The Americans would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that captured the one-sided nature of the engagement with cruel accuracy. For Sakai, standing on that carrier deck with his body broken and his faith shattered, the name didn't matter. What mattered was the look in the eyes of the surviving pilots, the hollow exhaustion of men who had finally understood that everything they believed about aerial combat, about honor, about the superiority of skill over material, had been a beautiful lie that was costing them their lives. By October 1944, Japan's situation had deteriorated from catastrophic to apocalyptic, a downward spiral so complete that even the word defeat seemed inadequate to describe what was happening to the nation's military capacity. The Marianas were lost, which meant American B-29 superfortresses could now reach the home islands, turning Japanese cities into targets for a bombing campaign that would dwarf anything seen in Europe. The Philippines, the resource-rich colonies that had been one of Japan's primary justifications for going to war in the first place, were being invaded by overwhelming American forces, supported by naval and air power that Japan simply could not match. And the fuel situation, always Japan's Achilles heel, had become so dire that pilot training had been reduced to skeletal minimums that bordered on criminal negligence. At Clark Field in the Philippines, Saburo Sakai found himself assigned to a role he had never imagined and deeply resented, grounded due to injuries sustained in the Marianas engagement and tasked with training the replacement pilots who arrived in a steady stream of doomed youth. These boys, and they were boys despite their ranks and uniforms, came to him with an average of 40 flight hours, some with as little as 30, asking him to teach them in a matter of days what had taken him years to master. Sakai would stand on the flight line, watching them practice basic maneuvers, and feel a rage so profound it threatened to consume him, not at the pilots who were trying their best with inadequate preparation, but at the system that was sending them to certain death while calling it duty. He tried to teach them the old ways, the elegant tactics that had made the Zero so deadly in the hands of a master, but there was no time for elegance. No fuel to practice the 1,000 repetitions that turned technique into instinct, no possibility of building the situational awareness that separated aces from casualties. The young pilots looked at him with hollow eyes that suggested they understood perfectly well what their futures held, and some nights Sakai would sit alone in his quarters and weep for them, these children being fed into the meat grinder of a lost war by commanders who refused to accept that tradition and courage were no longer sufficient currency to purchase victory. In early October, the orders came down that everyone knew were coming, but had hoped somehow to avoid. The Americans were landing at Leyte Gulf, and every available aircraft was to be thrown into the battle, regardless of the odds, regardless of pilot experience, regardless of the mathematical certainty that most would not return. Sakai was pulled back into combat status despite his injuries, despite his protests that he should remain training pilots, and he understood with bitter clarity that Japan had run out of options and was now simply throwing bodies at a problem that bodies could not solve. On the morning of October 24th, he led a formation of 12 Zeros toward an American fleet that had been reported by reconnaissance as containing over 40 carriers and hundreds of support vessels, and looking back at his wingman, he saw the face of his own younger brother in every teenage pilot struggling to hold formation. The interception came exactly as Sakai knew it would, American fighters appearing from altitude with the sun behind them, and what followed was not combat but execution. The Hellcats and Corsairs tore through the Japanese formation with practiced brutality, and Sakai's 17-year-old wingman, a boy named Yoshida who had been in his training group for less than a week and who had confided the night before that he was terrified of dying without ever kissing a girl, was killed in the first 30 seconds by a burst of 50 caliber fire that transformed his Zero into scattered debris before the boy could even register he was under attack. Sakai fought with the accumulated skill of 4 years of continuous combat, using every trick and maneuver that had kept him alive through dozens of engagements, and he managed to get one good deflection shot on a Hellcat that was too focused on another target to see him coming. His cannons hit true, and the American fighter staggered, trailing smoke, and for just a moment, Sakai felt the old satisfaction of a clean kill, his 65th victory, his last. Then 2 more Hellcats were on him, working in perfect coordination, and Sakai's Zero took hits that shredded his hydraulics and sent his control surfaces into partial failure. He fought the stick, trying to stay airborne, but the Americans were relentless, pressing their attack with the kind of methodical patience that suggested they had done this 1,000 times before and knew exactly how it would end. Another burst of fire ripped through his engine cowling, and suddenly his Mitsubishi Radial was coughing smoke and losing power, oil pressure dropping, temperature climbing, the whole mechanical symphony of a dying aircraft playing out in his instruments. Sakai made the decision to disengage before the engine seized completely, pushing the Zero into a shallow dive toward Clark Field while his formation disintegrated behind him, more voices crying out on the radio, more young men dying, more traditions sacrificed on the altar of a war that Japan had already lost, but refused to acknowledge. The glide back to base was a nightmare of mechanical failure and prayer, his engine cutting out completely twice before reluctantly catching again, his controls responding with the sluggish uncertainty of a badly wounded animal trying to reach safety. When Clark Field finally appeared below him, Sakai attempted to line up for landing, but his hydraulics were completely gone, his flaps wouldn't deploy, and he came in too fast and too high. The Zero hit the runway hard enough to collapse the landing gear, then skidded sideways in a shower of sparks and grinding metal that seemed to go on forever before finally stopping in a cloud of dust at the edge of the airfield. Medics pulled him from the wreckage with surprising gentleness, their faces showing the weary resignation of men who had performed this particular rescue too many times. And as they carried him toward the field hospital on a stretcher, Sakai heard the distinctive sound of American aircraft engines overhead. He turned his head, ignoring the pain in his neck, and watched as a formation of P-38 Lightnings strafed the field in lazy passes, destroying the handful of remaining Zeros on the ground, their twin fuselages and twin engines, marking them as yet another American design that prioritized firepower and survivability over the aesthetic purity that Japanese engineers had worshipped. The sky above Clark Field was filled with American aircraft flying in perfect formation, unchallenged, untouchable, masters of a domain they had seized through systematic innovation and industrial might. For 2 decades, Sakai had trained to be the perfect warrior of the sky, to embody the samurai ideal of individual excellence and honorable combat. And now he lay on a stretcher, watching the physical manifestation of everything he had believed proven obsolete. The Americans had not wanted a duel, they had wanted annihilation, and they had built the weapons, and developed the tactics, and created the industrial system to achieve it. Sakai closed his eyes against the brightness of the tropical sun, and thought about all the young pilots who had looked to him for wisdom, for guidance, for some reassurance that their sacrifice mattered, and he had no answers for them, because the truth was too terrible to speak aloud. They had died not for tactical advantage or strategic necessity, but because their nation's leadership had refused to adapt tradition to reality, had kept sending men into battle with obsolete doctrine and inadequate training because admitting the old ways no longer worked would have required a transformation of identity too painful to contemplate. The sound of American engines faded into the distance, and Sakai drifted into unconsciousness, wondering if he would wake up in a world that still had room for men like him, or if the future belonged entirely to the cold equations of industrial warfare, where individual excellence was just another variable to be optimized away. August 1945 brought an ending so absolute it seemed to stop time itself. 2 atomic bombs reducing Japanese cities to ash and forcing an empire to confront what its military leadership had refused to acknowledge for years, that the war was lost, had been lost for a long time, and continuing to fight was not honor but madness. Saburo Sakai heard the emperor's surrender broadcast from a hospital bed in Yokosuka, his body still healing from the injuries sustained at Clark Field, and felt something inside him break that had nothing to do with physical wounds. For 4 years he had flown and fought and killed, had watched friends die and students perish, had believed that courage and skill and the purity of the warrior's path would somehow be enough to overcome industrial might and technological innovation. Now the radio crackled with the voice of a god emperor admitting defeat, and Sakai understood with crushing finality that everything he had believed about the nature of warfare had been a beautiful lie that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The silence that followed the surrender was somehow worse than the chaos of combat, a quiet so profound it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. Sakai was eventually released from the hospital and returned to what remained of his hometown, a landscape of ash and rubble, where even the trees seemed to have given up trying to grow. The Zeros were gone, melted down for scrap metal, or left to rust in jungle clearings across the Pacific, and the men who had flown them were mostly dead, their names recorded in ledgers that would gather dust in forgotten archives, while the nation tried desperately to rebuild and forget the war that had nearly destroyed it. In the years that followed, Sakai found work as a printer, a mundane civilian occupation that seemed absurd for a man who had spent his youth as one of the deadliest fighter pilots in the world. But he embraced the normalcy with something like relief. He married, had children, and tried to build a life that had nothing to do with combat or killing, or the elegant death spirals of burning aircraft. But the war followed him in dreams, in the faces of the young pilots he had failed to save, in the memory of his final kill, and the knowledge that his 65 victories meant nothing in the calculus of a conflict decided not by individual heroism, but by systematic industrial annihilation. The Americans who had defeated him were not monsters, Sakai came to understand, but men who had simply approached warfare from a fundamentally different philosophical framework, one that prioritized effectiveness over elegance, survival over honor, and recognized that modern combat was an engineering problem to be solved, rather than a stage for individual glory. In the quiet of his printing shop, he would sometimes reflect on the Hellcat, that brutish, unglamorous aircraft that had shattered the myth of zero invincibility, and he came to appreciate the cold genius of its design. Every feature was purposeful. The armor that saved pilots' lives at the cost of maneuverability, the self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented the spectacular fireballs that had killed so many of his comrades, the massive engine that sacrificed fuel efficiency for raw climbing power, the 6 heavy machine guns that ensured one good burst was enough to kill rather than requiring extended aerobatic engagements. It was not beautiful, but it was devastatingly effective, and effectiveness had won the war while beauty had died in flames across the Pacific. Decades after the war ended, in one of those strange coincidences that history occasionally offers, Sakai received an invitation to travel to the United States and meet with American pilots he had fought against. Veterans who remembered the Zero with a mixture of respect and relief that they had survived encounters with aircraft that could outturn anything in the American inventory. The reunion took place at an aviation museum in California, and Sakai found himself standing beside men who had once tried to kill him, sharing stories and photographs, laughing at the absurdity of survival and the strange brotherhood of combat veterans who understand each other in ways civilians never can. One of the American pilots, a retired commander named Flatley, who had flown Hellcats throughout the Pacific campaign, walked Sakai through the museum's collection, and they stopped in front of a restored F6F that gleamed under the display lights, like it had just rolled off the production line. Flatley spoke with quiet pride about the aircraft's design philosophy, how every feature was a direct response to lessons learned in blood during the early war years, how American engineers had studied Zero tactics and capabilities, and built a fighter specifically to neutralize them. He explained the doctrine changes, the emphasis on teamwork over individual skill, the acceptance that bringing pilots home alive was more important than creating aces. And Sakai listened with the attentiveness of a student finally understanding a lesson he had failed to learn when it mattered. They moved to another display, where a restored Zero sat in silent testimony to a different philosophy, its lightweight construction and elegant lines, speaking to an aesthetic that prized purity and performance over pragmatism. Sakai ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the thin aluminum skin that had made the Zero so nimble and so fatally vulnerable, and he smiled with an expression that carried decades of hard-won wisdom. He told Flatley that the Japanese had fought with their hearts, while the Americans had fought with their heads, and in the end the head always wins, because hearts can be broken, but logic adapts and overcomes. The Hellcat's final statistics were almost absurd in their one-sidedness. 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed against 270 Hellcats lost in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of 19-1 that represented not just technological superiority, but a complete philosophical victory of systematic pragmatism over romantic tradition. These numbers, carved into plaques and recorded in histories, told the story of a nation that had understood the fundamental nature of industrial warfare, while its enemy had clung to pre-modern notions of honor and individual excellence. Sakai returned to Japan carrying a photograph of himself standing between a Zero and a Hellcat, 2 aircraft that represented not just different design philosophies, but entirely different worldviews about how human beings should organize violence and what values should guide nations at war. He placed the photograph on his desk in the printing shop, and would sometimes look at it during quiet moments, remembering the young men who had died, believing the Zero's elegance would somehow be enough, remembering his own certainty that skill and courage could overcome material disadvantage, remembering the bitter lesson that tradition must bend to reality or it will break, and the breaking will cost everything. The war had taught the world a truth written in blood across the Pacific skies, that innovation trumps dogma, that adaptation beats tradition, that pragmatism defeats romanticism, and that the nations which understand these principles will inherit the future, while those that cling to the past will be swept away by forces they refuse to acknowledge until too late. The Zero was a masterpiece, and the men who flew it were warriors of extraordinary skill and courage. But masterpieces and warriors were not enough against an enemy that had reinvented the rules of combat and built the tools to enforce those new rules with industrial efficiency. This was the hard truth that Saburo Sakai carried for the rest of his long life, a truth that military strategists and historians would study for generations, that in modern warfare, the side that learns fastest wins, and the side that clings to tradition loses regardless of how beautiful that tradition might be or how bravely its adherents fight in its defense.